The sound of the heart monitor shattered the silence with one long, relentless tone. Just moments earlier, Jimin had been smiling through quiet exhaustion, while Jungkook believed there would always be another chance to say everything left unspoken. Instead, time seemed to freeze as doctors rushed into the room and the world around them collapsed. Every regret, every misunderstanding, and every hidden sacrifice suddenly carried unbearable weight. But what no one inside that hospital knew was that Jimin's failing heart was only the beginning of a devastating truth, one that would force Jungkook to confront a secret capable of changing both their lives forever. Could love survive when every heartbeat came too late? The days leading to that unforgettable moment had seemed almost ordinary, at least to everyone watching from the outside. Jimin and Jungkook continued moving through their demanding schedules with the same quiet professionalism that had always defined them. Cameras captured warm smiles, rehearsals reflected flawless teamwork, and every public appearance suggested an unbreakable bond built over years of shared dreams, relentless sacrifices, and unwavering trust. Yet beneath those carefully maintained expressions, an invisible burden had already begun to grow, one that neither of them truly understood until it was almost too late. Jimin had always been the kind of person who carried pain in silence. He believed protecting the people he loved often meant hiding his own struggles, convincing himself that exhaustion was simply another challenge to overcome. Even when his body begged for rest, he continued giving everything he had, refusing to let anyone worry. Every smile required more strength than the one before, every performance demanded another piece of the energy he no longer possessed, and every quiet night ended with a lingering ache he dismissed as nothing more than temporary fatigue. Jungkook noticed the smallest changes long before anyone else did. The sparkle that usually filled Jimin's expressive eyes sometimes disappeared between rehearsals. His movements became slightly slower whenever he thought no one was looking, and there were fleeting moments when he would press a hand against his chest before forcing another reassuring smile. Each time Jungkook tried to convince himself it was only stress, another uneasy feeling settled deeper inside him, refusing to disappear no matter how many excuses he made. Around them, RM, Jin, Sugar, J-Hope, and Taehyung remained focused on supporting one another through the endless demands of their busy lives. They laughed together, practiced together, and celebrated small victories that reminded them why they had endured so much over the years. Even so, each of them quietly sensed that something about Jimin felt different. It was never obvious enough to raise alarm, yet impossible to ignore completely. A strange silence had begun replacing his usual warmth whenever the room grew quiet, as though he was fighting a battle no one else could see. Unknown to everyone, a single decision Jimin had made weeks earlier would slowly become the turning point of every life connected to his own. Hidden behind locked doors and unread messages lay a truth he had chosen to keep buried, believing that protecting Jungkook from worry mattered more than protecting himself. It was a choice made out of love, but one destined to unleash heartbreak that none of them were prepared to face. As the days passed, the invisible distance between Jimin and Jungkook widened in ways neither of them intended. It was never caused by anger or fading affection, but by silence that slowly replaced the conversations they once shared without hesitation. Every missed opportunity to speak honestly became another fragile wall separating two hearts that still cared deeply for one another. Jungkook found himself watching Jimin more often than before. During rehearsals, he noticed the subtle moments when Jimin paused for just a second longer after an intense routine. Tiny beads of sweat lingered on his face even after resting, and his breathing occasionally became uneven before he quickly regained control. Whenever their eyes met, Jimin answered with the same reassuring smile, convincing everyone around him that everything was perfectly fine. Yet that smile no longer reached his eyes, and Jungkook could feel an unsettling fear growing stronger with every passing day. Jimin, meanwhile, quietly accepted the weight he had chosen to carry alone. Deep inside, he had already received a medical warning that could change everything. The doctors had urged him to stop ignoring the symptoms, explaining that continued physical strain could place dangerous stress on his heart. But instead of sharing the truth with Jungkook or the rest of the members, Jimin buried the report where no one would ever find it. He convinced himself that worrying the people he loved would only become another burden they did not deserve. That secret demanded a painful price. Every rehearsal became a silent battle against dizziness. Every performance required him to ignore the sharp discomfort that occasionally spread through his chest. Each successful day convinced everyone else that he was recovering from nothing more than ordinary exhaustion, while in reality his condition was becoming more unpredictable. The stronger he appeared on the outside, the more fragile he became within. Taehyung was the first to sense that Jimin's silence carried more than simple fatigue. There were moments when he caught Jimin staring blankly through the practice room window long after everyone else had left. RM noticed unusual gaps in Jimin's focus during meetings, while Jin quietly prepared extra meals, hoping proper rest and nutrition would help. Sugar and J-Hope exchanged word glances more than once, unable to explain the growing feeling that something important was being hidden from all of them. Then one ordinary evening, everything changed without warning. As Jungkook walked back toward the rehearsal studio after retrieving a forgotten item, he accidentally noticed a sealed medical envelope lying beneath a chair. Jimin rushed to hide it before Jungkook could read the contents, but for a single fleeting second, one word on the document caught Jungkook's attention, a word that instantly filled his heart with fear. It was enough to make him realize that the person he trusted most had been hiding a truth far more terrifying than he had ever imagined, and the answers he desperately sought were only beginning to surface. That brief glimpse of the medical envelope refused to leave Jungkook's mind. The single unfamiliar term he had seen was enough to shatter every reassuring explanation he had created for himself over the previous weeks. From that moment forward, every memory replayed differently. Jimin's forced smiles no longer looked reassuring. His quiet moments no longer seemed like ordinary fatigue. Every hesitant step, every deep breath after rehearsals, and every attempt to change the subject suddenly felt like pieces of a frightening puzzle that had been hidden in plain sight. Instead of confronting Jimin immediately, Jungkook convinced himself that he needed certainty before allowing fear to consume them both. He quietly paid closer attention, hoping he would discover a simple explanation that would erase the growing anxiety inside him. Yet each passing day only deepened his concern. Jimin began arriving earlier than everyone else, often sitting alone in the empty practice room with his eyes closed, gathering enough strength to face another exhausting schedule. By the time the other members arrived, the familiar smile had already returned, carefully masking the exhaustion that lingered beneath it. The burden of pretending became heavier than Jimin had expected. His body no longer recovered as quickly after long rehearsals, and even simple movements occasionally triggered waves of dizziness that forced him to pause in secret. Whenever no one was watching, he leaned against the nearest wall, breathing slowly until the pounding inside his chest settled enough for him to continue. Each episode ended with the same silent promise to himself that he would endure just one more day, then another, believing that protecting everyone else's peace of mind mattered more than admitting his own vulnerability. Meanwhile, the rest of the members unknowingly found themselves caught between concern and uncertainty. RM sensed the tension growing but respected Jimin's privacy, trusting that he would speak when he was ready. Jin quietly encouraged everyone to take more breaks, hoping the relentless pace would ease. Sugar became unusually observant, noticing details that others overlooked but unable to connect them into a complete picture. J-Hope tried to lift the atmosphere with laughter, while Taehyung watched both Jimin and Jungkook with increasing unease, recognizing that an invisible wall had begun separating two people who had once understood each other without words. The silence eventually created its own misunderstanding. Jungkook began believing that Jimin no longer trusted him enough to share what truly mattered. Every unanswered question felt less like protection and more like distance. At the same time, Jimin interpreted Jungkook's growing caution as emotional withdrawal, convincing himself that creating distance now would make it less painful if the worst ever happened. Both were acting out of love, yet every decision pushed them farther apart. Then came the evening that changed everything. During an intense rehearsal, the room echoed with music and synchronized movement as everyone focused on perfecting the final routine. For a few brief moments, Jimin appeared stronger than he had in days, matching every step with remarkable determination. But hidden beneath that determination, his body had already reached its limit. As the final sequence approached, an overwhelming pain surged through his chest. His vision blurred, the rhythm around him faded into silence, and the floor beneath his feet suddenly felt impossibly far away. Before anyone fully understood what was happening, Jimin's balance gave way, leaving everyone frozen as the unthinkable began to unfold. For one suspended heartbeat, the practice room fell into complete silence. The music continued to echo through the speakers, but no one seemed capable of hearing it anymore. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Jimin as he collapsed without warning, his body striking the polished floor with a force that instantly erased every remaining doubt. What had once been dismissed as simple exhaustion had transformed into a terrifying reality unfolding before everyone who cared about him. Jungkook reacted before fear had time to become thought. Instinct carried him across the room, dropping to his knees beside Jimin with trembling hands. The color had drained from Jimin's face, his breathing had become frighteningly shallow, and his eyelids barely moved despite every desperate attempt to find a sign of awareness. The familiar warmth that had always comforted Jungkook now felt distant, replaced by an unbearable uncertainty that tightened around his chest with every passing second. RM immediately took control of the chaos, urging everyone to remain calm while emergency services were called. Jin knelt nearby, his normally steady composure shaken by the sight before him. Sugar stood frozen, unable to reconcile the image of the resilient Jimin he had always known with the fragile figure lying motionless on the floor. J-Hope's optimism disappeared behind visible panic, while Taehyung watched in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the realization that every quiet warning they had sensed over the previous weeks had been real. As paramedics rushed Jimin to the hospital, the atmosphere inside the ambulance became a race against time. Monitors flashed unstable readings that neither Jungkook nor the others fully understood, yet every alarm carried the same terrifying message. Jungkook remained close, refusing to let his eyes leave Jimin even for a moment. His mind replayed countless memories with painful clarity, shared laughter after exhausting rehearsals, quiet encouragement during difficult days, and every opportunity he had missed to ask the questions that truly mattered. Regret settled heavily inside him, growing stronger with every passing mile. At the hospital, doctors moved with urgent precision, disappearing behind emergency room doors that closed with a finality none of them were prepared to face. The long hallway became painfully silent. Minutes stretched into what felt like endless hours, and every passing second deepened the fear that had already taken hold of everyone waiting outside. No one spoke much. There were no comforting words capable of easing the uncertainty that hung over them. Then a nurse emerged carrying a sealed folder that had been found among Jimin's personal belongings. Believing it contained information the medical team urgently needed, she handed it to RM. Inside were medical reports dated several weeks earlier, revealing repeated warnings about a serious heart condition that required immediate treatment and complete rest. Page after page confirmed the same devastating truth. Jimin had known the risks all along. He had hidden every diagnosis, every recommendation, and every frightening prediction, choosing to shoulder the burden alone while convincing everyone else that he was simply tired. Jungkook stood motionless as the truth settled over him. Every misunderstanding, every moment of distance, and every unanswered question suddenly made heartbreaking sense. But before anyone could fully process the revelation, a piercing alarm echoed from inside the emergency unit. Doctors rushed frantically past the waiting room, their expressions leaving no room for hope. Jungkook's heart sank as he realized the battle they feared most had only just begun. The piercing alarm continued without mercy, echoing through the emergency corridor like a countdown no one could stop. Every doctor and nurse who rushed past wore the same expression of urgent determination, and with each passing second the silence among the waiting members grew heavier. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The brightly lit hallway that had once felt ordinary now became a place where hope and despair stood painfully side by side. Jungkook remained frozen outside the emergency room doors, unable to look away from the small window that revealed only blurred movement inside. Shadows crossed the room in frantic succession. Medical equipment surrounded Jimin's motionless figure, while specialists worked tirelessly to stabilize the heart that had suddenly betrayed him. Every glimpse felt like another knife twisting deeper into Jungkook's conscience. He could no longer escape the crushing realization that Jimin had endured unimaginable fear completely alone. The medical reports rested in RM's hands, but everyone had already memorized their devastating contents. The diagnosis had not appeared overnight. It had progressed quietly over months, accompanied by repeated recommendations to reduce physical strain, undergo further treatment, and avoid overwhelming stress. Instead, Jimin had continued rehearsing, performing, comforting others, and protecting everyone's happiness while sacrificing his own well-being. Every page told the story of someone who believed his own suffering was a price worth paying if it spared the people he loved from worry. That truth shattered Jungkook from within. Every memory returned with painful clarity. The evenings when Jimin insisted he was only tired. The rehearsals where he quietly stepped away for a few moments before returning with another reassuring smile. The countless opportunities Jungkook had dismissed because he wanted to believe everything would be fine. What he had mistaken for emotional distance had actually been desperate determination. Jimin had never been pulling away. He had been protecting everyone until his body simply could not continue. Guilt settled over Jungkook with unbearable weight. If he had insisted on the truth instead of accepting every excuse, perhaps things would have unfolded differently. If he had recognized that love sometimes meant refusing to accept comforting lies, perhaps Jimin would already have been receiving treatment instead of fighting for his life behind those closed doors. Those unanswered possibilities repeated endlessly inside his mind, each one more painful than the last. Around him, the others carried their own silent burdens. Jin quietly wiped away tears he could no longer hide. Sugar lowered his head, replaying every conversation in search of clues he had overlooked. J-Hope's usual optimism had vanished completely, replaced by helpless prayers that required no words. Taehyung stared at the emergency room entrance without blinking, haunted by the memory of every time he had sensed something was wrong but chosen to respect Jimin's silence instead of challenging it. Then another doctor emerged. His exhausted expression revealed that the crisis was far from over. He explained that Jimin's heart had stopped for a brief but terrifying moment before the medical team managed to restore a heartbeat. Although circulation had returned, his condition remained critically unstable, and the next several hours would determine whether his body could recover from the immense strain it had endured. Nothing was certain. Every minute ahead carried the possibility of hope, or irreversible loss. Those words broke whatever strength Jungkook had left. For the first time since the nightmare began, he allowed himself to confront the terrifying truth he had been refusing to accept. Love was not measured only by the moments shared together, but also by the words left unsaid, the fears hidden behind reassuring smiles, and the opportunities that disappeared forever when silence was mistaken for strength. Standing outside that hospital room, Jungkook silently promised that if fate granted Jimin one more chance, he would never again allow pride, misunderstanding, or unspoken fear to stand between them. But fate had one final test waiting beyond the intensive care doors, and its outcome would change every life connected to Jimin forever. The hours that followed became the longest anyone could remember. Daylight slowly faded beyond the hospital windows, replaced by the cold glow of the city lights, yet no one left the waiting area. Every passing nurse caused their hearts to race. Every opening of the intensive care unit doors felt like the beginning of an answer they were almost too afraid to hear. Hope survived only in fragile moments, constantly threatened by the uncertainty hanging over the quiet hallway. Jungkook barely moved from the chair outside the ICU. The exhaustion in his body meant nothing compared to the weight pressing against his heart. His thoughts wandered through years of memories that now carried a painful new meaning. He remembered the countless times Jimin had quietly encouraged him during difficult moments, always placing someone else's happiness ahead of his own. Looking back, Jungkook realized that while Jimin had been protecting everyone emotionally, no one had truly been protecting Jimin. The members remained together in silent support. RM spoke with the doctors whenever new updates became available, carefully absorbing every detail before sharing it with the others. Jin continued making sure everyone ate and rested, even though he could barely bring himself to do the same. Sugar remained unusually quiet, reflecting on how easily strength could disguise suffering. J-Hope tried to preserve even the smallest spark of optimism, believing that hope itself could become a source of strength. Taehyung never stopped watching the ICU doors, carrying a quiet determination that if Jimin awakened, things would never be allowed to return to the way they had been. Late that night, the chief cardiologist finally approached with a cautious update. Jimin's heartbeat had stabilized, but his body remained extremely weak after the cardiac arrest. The doctors believed the next stage of recovery would depend not only on medical treatment, but also on reducing the emotional and physical burdens that had overwhelmed him for so long. They explained the prolonged stress, relentless exhaustion, and the habit of silently carrying every responsibility had become just as dangerous as the underlying heart condition itself. Those words struck everyone deeply. It was no longer simply a story about illness. It had become a painful reminder of what can happen when someone believes they must endure every hardship alone. The realization spread quietly among the group, changing the way each of them viewed the months that had led to this heartbreaking night. Then, as dawn approached, a nurse hurried out of the intensive care unit with an expression that instantly stole everyone's breath. She informed them that Jimin had shown the first faint signs of consciousness. It was only a slight movement, barely noticeable, but it was enough for the medical team to begin believing that he was fighting his way back. Jungkook closed his eyes in overwhelming relief, but the emotion was quickly replaced by determination. If Jimin opened his eyes again, nothing would be left unsaid. No fear would remain hidden behind reassuring smiles. No burden would be carried alone. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, not separated by silence, misunderstanding, or sacrifice. The following days unfolded with a mixture of cautious hope and lingering fear. Although Jimin's condition had stabilized enough to ease the immediate danger, recovery remained uncertain. The doctors warned that surviving the cardiac arrest was only the beginning. His body had endured tremendous strain, and the emotional burdens he had carried for so long could not simply disappear overnight. Every small improvement felt like a victory, yet every setback reminded everyone how close they had come to losing him forever. When Jimin finally opened his eyes fully, the moment carried none of the dramatic celebration people often imagined. Instead, it arrived quietly. The room was still. The machines continued their steady rhythm. Sunlight filtered softly through the hospital curtains. For a few seconds, confusion crossed Jimin's face as he struggled to understand where he was. Then awareness returned, followed almost immediately by the realization that his secret had finally been exposed. The weight of that realization settled heavily in his eyes. For weeks, perhaps even months, he had convinced himself that silence was an act of love. He had believed that protecting everyone from worry justified hiding the truth. Yet as he looked around the room and saw the exhaustion written across the faces of the people who had remained by his side, he began to understand the consequences of that choice. The pain he had tried to prevent had arrived anyway, only now it had become far greater. Outside the room, Jungkook stood frozen when he received confirmation that Jimin was awake. The relief was so overwhelming that for a moment he could not move. Every terrifying possibility that had haunted him during those endless hours in the hospital suddenly collided with the reality that Jimin was still here. Breathing. Fighting. Surviving. Yet relief did not erase the guilt. If anything, it made the guilt sharper. Because now that the immediate crisis had passed, Jungkook could no longer focus solely on fear. He was forced to confront everything that had happened before the collapse. The unanswered questions. The growing distance. The moments when concern had been replaced by assumptions. The opportunities to push harder for the truth that he had allowed to slip away. As recovery continued, emotions that had been buried beneath panic slowly surfaced. RM spent long hours speaking with medical specialists, determined to understand every aspect of Jimin's condition so that nothing similar could ever be overlooked again. Jin devoted himself to creating a calm and supportive environment, quietly ensuring that everyone remembered to care for themselves while caring for Jimin. Sugar reflected deeply on the dangerous habit of enduring suffering in silence. J-Hope focused on rebuilding optimism, reminding everyone that healing required patience as much as determination. Taehyung became one of the strongest advocates for honesty, believing that the entire ordeal had revealed the cost of hiding pain from those who genuinely cared. The experience changed all of them. Not because they had witnessed illness, but because they had witnessed what isolation could do to a person surrounded by love. Weeks later, as Jimin slowly regained strength, another truth began to emerge. The physical recovery was progressing. The emotional recovery was far more difficult. The memories remained vivid. The hospital alarms. The frantic rush through emergency corridors. The devastating medical reports. The terrifying words explaining that his heart had stopped. Those memories lingered in everyone's minds. Especially Jungkook's. Certain nights, he found himself unable to sleep. The image of Jimin collapsing replayed without warning. The fear returned just as intensely as it had felt that day. No matter how many positive updates arrived, a part of him remained trapped inside that hospital corridor, staring helplessly through the emergency room window. Yet something else had changed as well. The silence that once separated them no longer existed. The walls built by fear, misunderstanding, and misplaced sacrifice had finally been torn down. For the first time in a long time, vulnerability no longer felt like weakness. It felt necessary. And as that understanding grew, so did something stronger than fear. Trust. Not the effortless trust that comes from believing everything is fine, but the deeper trust that comes from facing painful truths together. Months later, when life gradually returned to a more familiar rhythm, the scars of that experience remained visible in unexpected ways. Schedules became more balanced. Rest was treated as a priority rather than a luxury. Concerns were voiced instead of hidden. Difficult emotions were shared instead of buried. Most importantly, no one allowed themselves to assume that a smile automatically meant everything was okay. Because they had learned a lesson none of them would ever forget. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones suffering most quietly. Sometimes the people trying hardest to protect everyone else are the very people who need help themselves. And sometimes a single heartbeat, or the terrifying absence of one, can reveal truths that years of ordinary life never could. Long after the hospital stay became a memory, the story continued to live inside everyone who experienced it. Not as a story of tragedy, but as a story of awakening. A reminder that love is not proven through silent sacrifice. Love is proven through trust, through honesty, through allowing others to stand beside you when life becomes too heavy to carry alone. And for Jungkook, The memory of that long, devastating night would forever remain the moment that changed everything. Because the day Jimin's heart stopped was also the day everyone finally learned how precious a single heartbeat truly is. Even after the doctors finally declared that Jimin was well enough to leave the hospital, no one believed the journey had truly ended. Recovery no longer meant simply walking out of the intensive care unit. It meant rebuilding a life that had nearly been taken away in a single, terrifying moment. Every step outside the hospital doors felt different, as though the world itself had slowed down to remind them that nothing, not success, not schedules, not expectations, was more valuable than a single human life. The days that followed were filled with quiet victories. A short walk without exhaustion became a reason to smile. A peaceful night of uninterrupted sleep became something to celebrate. The laughter that slowly returned carried a depth it had never possessed before, because everyone understood how close they had come to losing it forever. Even ordinary mornings felt extraordinary after surviving a night that had once seemed impossible to overcome.